So good evening, everyone, and welcome back to Sliver's Summer Edition. My name is Maja Osvaldic, and together with my colleague Kalko Yu, Sliver is happy to be back, and we are looking forward to another intense lecture lineup compiled with the support of our faculty at the IoA, and we are excited about the compilation of globally scattered architectural design and curatorial practices complemented by a contribution from the field of tech criticism as a reflection of the 3 decades of the people's history of the internet. And today we are opening the summer playlist with a long-awaited lecture by Jose Sanchez. We've been trying to set it up for a year. We have been waiting or hoping that the whole traveling situation would change, but it did not. And but nonetheless, we are very, very happy to have Jose today with us, at least via Zoom. Jose Sanchez is an architect, game designer, and theorist based in Detroit, Michigan, or as he just shared with us, currently in Santiago in Chile, where he is actually originally from. He is the director of Plethora Project, a research studio investigating in the future of the propagation of architectural design knowledge. He is the creator of video games Blockhood and Commonhood, which are digital social platforms that aid the authoring of architectural and ecological thinking to non-expert audiences. His project Bloom was the winner of the Wonder Series hosted by the City of London for the 2012 Olympics. And his game Blockhood won Best Gameplay Award at the Games for Change Festival in New York in 2016. He has taught in renowned institutions in the United States and in Europe, including the AA, the Bartlett, and UCS in Los Angeles. He recently relocated to Detroit, at least with his teaching, and joined the University of Michigan, where he is an associate professor at the Taubman College School of Architecture. His research, Architecture for the Commons, designs and interrogates social media platforms as tools with the potential to author architectural content in the public domain. And while we were waiting, so in the past year, also Jose's book hit the shelves. It is titled Architecture for the Commons, Participatory Systems in the Age of Global Platforms. And I think the Jose's background is part of the inverted cover that the book has. The book dives into the analysis of how the tectonics of buildings is fundamentally linked to the economic organizations they allow them to exist. And in line with his research, the book also addresses the notion of commons from various perspectives and makes the case for strategies of knowledge propagation and distributed practices for architectural literacy. In accordance to all this, the lecture tonight is called Platform Realism. So with a warm welcome, I hand over the screen to Jose Sanchez.
Thank you, Maya, and thanks again for the invitation to take part of this series. It's something that, as you mentioned, that we have been planning for quite some time, and I wish I had the chance to visit in person and engage with the Institute, which is one of my favorite places in terms of the architecture and the thinking that is happening. So today, I kind of want to part from some of the ideas presented in the book, which I'm going to briefly share with you as well. And I really want to address my in a way, thinking what is the next chapter, where am I going with some of the work, and also a reflection on what seems to be happening where I'm from in Chile, which is being kind of a big driver for some of the thinking and the work. So really, I want to start with this idea of realism and perhaps reflect upon the affordances of realism. As you mentioned, I recently relocated to the city of Detroit, where I have the great opportunity to experience the Diego Rivera paintings. And I was struck by how I could reflect somehow the relationship that some of these paintings had with my own work. There's an interest of depicting the body, labor, in a very realistic fashion. The use of figures really kind of give us a sense of an economic condition and different social conditions that were depicted present at the time. Mm-hmm. The work of Rivera was using murals was not alone. It was certainly part of a large movement in Mexico. People like Orozco or Siqueiros were very much some of the big muralists that were kind of using these large formats and really explicitly using public forms of murals to engage in a social discourse. I was also struck by some of the ideology behind some of these murals, as it was kind of pointed out by the Syndicate of Technical Workers. The movement behind these murals had to do with the repudiation of ultra-intellectual art, and they were really looking for public art, forms that would engage the public in different ways. This has been also recently analyzed how influential some of this work was for people like Elizabeth Catlett, in the production of on her work, and many others who have used the medium of realism to really depict some of the social struggles that people in the US are facing. I don't need to remind anyone that the US is really going through an important time, a time of social transformations, both economic and social in many ways. And that reality is something that I consider is quite global, as I've been facing in my own country, in Chile, where we recently approved an attempt to kind of change the constitution. So there was an 80% or almost an 80% of approval to really change the constitution, and an important social uprising to kind of say no more to a constitution that has been stated since the dictatorship of Augusto Pinochet 30 years ago. So I think that there's a kind of a profound reflection for the Chilean population of how does the 21st century constitution look like? And there's certainly a lot of material to reflect upon these ideas. And we're all invited to vote and take part of this process, right? We are invited to think about what is the rights of privacy in the light of social media platforms, as someone like Shoshana Zuboff might point it out. In my book, I discussed the work from Aaron Swartz, and I think that it's important to reflect upon the right of access. Is housing a human right? And the right to housing, as some of my students have been researching, it's perhaps also some of the inquiries that are out there. And also reflections upon property. I think that some of the work that I'm doing with my students as well reflects upon how do we conceive and how can we innovate in some degree on notions of property. And I think that the work of David Bollier has been, in relation to the commons, has been certainly instrumental to consider some of these ideas. Again, other ideas such as the rights of native populations and ecological, implications of our work, I think that are central when we start thinking such an important document as a constitution. And it's not a coincidence, I would say, that within the Chilean context, the use of a mural or a form of public art has become an important vehicle for communication. In architecture, the group for a kind of the group is called Por un Habitat Justo, which is for a just form of living, has brought together a collective of students and academics to really depict some of the living conditions that some of the current economic practices are putting in place. This is the demonstration of how small apartments and the price associated with these apartments that are currently in the market are really going for, right? Demonstrating the injustices that are taking place in the city. So with that, I really want to kind of reflect upon some of the ideas that, as Maya presented, are shown in my book. I want to quickly, for those who haven't had the chance to maybe take a look at it, to go through some of the key points that are certainly create a kind of a parallel with the work. I'll dive into the work later, but the book tries to make a conscious attempt to separate some of the ideas, and because in many cases the projects do not completely achieve some of the concepts and the ideas that are presented theoretical. So these are some of the chapters of the book. I want to try to quickly go through them. So the book starts with a kind of a criticism to how we have been measuring forms of architectural progress. And here I was someone that studied under Patrick Schumacher. And I think that the rhetoric of the freedom of form and the liberty of form as a form of parametric variation, as a form of a metric of progress is something that I put in doubt, certainly. The idea of Buckminster Fuller in terms of coining the term ephemeralization is something as well that I suggest there's a kind of a failure there, in the sense, not how architecture in Fuller's sense has become more ephemeral, but perhaps in the way in which such ephemerality has been able to reach a broader audience. In a way, the ideas of prosperity that Fuller was hoping for, I think that they haven't been realized. We have been able to do more with less, but that hasn't really become, or trickled down, if you want, to kind of a large portion of the population. And we see that the book starts analyzing a paradigm very much driven by a form of vertical integration, the organization of industry to kind of consolidate vertical production chains. And this is why I describe us as a coalescence of parts. And I use examples as 3D printing and, for instance, the Ion engine from relativity space, and a series of industries that have been able to shortcut different industries or kind of reduce the number of participants that have a seat in the table in the moment of design through technologies like 3D printing, right? So we see something that might have taken several parts and the connection of parts, and those are kind of slowly reduced into a far more efficient, perhaps, unit or part. But in that process, in that coalescence, there is kind of an important social impact that I wanna discuss, right? So we can see that in the model between the brick and the mortar has kind of replaced the brick, and the continuation of form and the monolithic nature of some of these forms comes with, again, important social implications. I also discuss how proprietary parts, in the case of Apple, like the introduction of things like the pentalobe screw, are examples of parts that try to alienate a user. There's a whole movement, the right to repair movement, that has been seeking and resisting the kind of the enclosure of products, where products are in a way purposely connected or creating coalescence between parts to avoid the repair of citizens and really kind of allow for the repair to happen in a much more centralized way. So I really kind of started, developing a defense for parts. What is the kind of different attitudes that we had in the past in regards to parts, as I kind of show in the left. I believe that the tradition of architecture has really followed a kind of a closed topology mechanic where we kind of think of parts as kind of composing a whole, and I really kind of advocate for a discrete form of architecture that is certainly kind of an open topology model. My own work in some degree starts reflecting and probing some of these ideas, and I'll talk about Bloom in a minute, which is the project that you can see on screen. But certainly I kind of put in the table the work of several architects, including Gilles de Retsin and many others, as you can see on screen, the work of discrete forms of architecture that try to consider distributed form of practice of architecture, one in which multiple producers of parts could actually create coordination and patterns between the organization of those parts. Right? Later in the book, I start, having a framework for actually considering a kind of a participatory or a kind of a multi-actor form of production of architecture. What would be the immaterial architectures? What would be the network technologies that would allow for such recombinations and patterns to emerge? And here I kind of look at the work of Joanna Friedman, who in '67 was already considering FlatWriter, a kind of a prototypical software for the organization or the kind of coordination of units in Villa Mobile, and how other video games today, such as Folded or City Skylines, have really become much closer to reality in their capacity to engage science in some degree, and you know, the production of protein folding solutions or kind of urban environments that could kind of replicate urban conditions. My own work certainly follows this trajectory. The game Blockhood, which again I'm going to show in a bit, attempts to start kind of bringing that thought into architecture, and how do we can discretize and think of the city as a series of units that could be arranged and patterned by users through a computer interface in a video game environment. My latest video game, Commonhood, tries to do that at the scale of labor and the factory as well. And in a way, the final kind of consideration of the book really starts thinking about, where does this value come from? Like, how do we, when we start creating or organizing ourselves to produce content, again, for ourselves, the practice of self-provision, there's a form of value production that really becomes rooted in those communities that produce it, right? So I think examples like WikiHow or the Open Source Ecology and Open Building Institute are great examples that are kind of showing how such practices could take place, forms of open source architecture that try to kind of find local codes. And in many ways, I think that there has been, I've always been a big admirer of some of the work in Chile, especially of Open City in Ritoque by the cooperative Amareda, who has understood the role of an architect, not just as someone that is distant from a community, but is perhaps embedded and is really kind of working from within, and the creation of codes and culture really emerges out of a kind of a symbiotic loop between the architect and a social system. So most of my work really is founded on the notion of what I call social combinatorics. And as I mentioned, in the projects have been an opportunity to experiment in many different scales and mediums and formats. How can social systems be coupled with rule-based systems, algorithmic systems, and what are the strengths, if you want, or opportunities by coupling the social and the rule-based or the algorithmic, right? The first project that I kind of developed in this direction was Bloom, a collaboration with Alessandra Sheck for the 2012 Olympics. And it was very much the idea of considering a building block that would have implicit rule sets in these terms. In this case, a series of organizational joints that would determine how larger formations would occur, right? Similar to a Lego brick, but we were really playing with the flexibility of the material, the weight of the material, how structures would ultimately be achieved, and thinking of a piece that could be handled, that was, you know, light in weight, but also could be easy to manipulate, because we really wanted to open the system to, again, the crowd, the public. So not all patterns, not all organizations were pre-thought or determined through a rule set, but rather was kind of an opportunity to play. I was really exploring the different affordances of the system, right? Most of the interesting examples that we saw from Bloom were the unexpected moments, the constructions that were really had meaning for the users that took part on it. And recent work, more recent physical projects like Foliage, which was a competition entry, and a research that I was doing at USC, start to think about how, you know, traditional standardized hardware can really be a kind of a small investment or a small attempt to, what is the smallest intervention that we as architects can make to kind of reorient a material system or give new opportunities to a material system as standardized would. So we designed this joint, which doesn't really say much when it's actually not connected to these 4x4 sticks. And you could see how the joint tries to kind of define the vector organization of timber rods, right? And it really starts defining the pattern, or kind of creating rules for the pattern of aggregation of in this case, this kind of space frame. So this is a small prototype that we produce as part of a proof of concept of what a system could do at a larger scale. And these are kind of some of the configurations that we were kind of speculating that we could produce with this system. Again, the project was never set in stone. It was always thought as a malleable, something that could, both in the simulation world, but also through gameplay, could take multiple forms. And in many ways, the presentation of such a project needed a playful device, a form of model that was not a finite model. We could have 3D printed a model and send it for the competition, but in this case, we thought it was more convenient or more connected to the ideas of the project to really produce a toy, a box of parts and certain instructions that would allow the jury to either build our kind of example or kind of take it somewhere else, perhaps play with it in different forms. So for us, the communication of, the learning, the steps to actually understand how the system works, and then from that point of knowledge, eventually kind of hack it and break it and take it somewhere else, was very much our proposition for this biennial, not to have a final proposition for an installation, but rather a participatory system that would involve the community in a process of form finding, right? So it's a form of social form finding, if you want. And this is kind of the configuration that we tutorialized, or we kind of, and we were also kind of suggesting that this could happen both at the toy level and in a digital context, right? So this is a kind of developing these forms within the commonhood environment, which is the video game that I'm gonna show in a minute. And in many ways, the work that has been done in a physical medium, I've always thought that the gameplay aspect of the projects, it was certainly limited by the physicality and for those who had access to it. And I kind of, early on, I started envisioning to do simulations. I did a lot of kind of generative work in the past, and most of the work that I had been doing with programming was completely encoded by, in this case, myself, like the designer. But I was really trying to think of open systems that would open these simulations to the public. And I moved into video games because video games really gave me an opportunity to have a much more explicit bias. And I'll try to describe what that means through the projects that come ahead. So the first consideration is that video games can really become platforms, right? Platforms for me has become a really important point of analysis and criticism, in the sense that today perhaps we could see social platforms as some of the most controversial and problematic forms of network technology that are kind of very ubiquitous in terms of popular adoption. So we're talking about things like Facebook, YouTube, and so on. And the reflection behind things like platform capitalism by Chernyshek, or surveillance capitalism by Shoshana Zuboff has to do with how data is extracted from the user, how platform providers are able to really exploit in many ways the information that is obtained from these platforms, right? It was revealed through the whistleblower Christopher Wiley that the power of this data can really have important impact in our democracy, right? And I think that there's been a series of, I wouldn't say antidotes, but certainly people that have envisioned ways in which we could resist some of the challenges of platform design, and suggesting that there should be certain standards for maintaining these technologies within an ethical framework. And Julian Sanchez is certainly one of them. The ideas of cryptography that he's been advocating for him are really a form of nonviolent direct action, right? Where strong cryptography can really oppose the extraction of users' data in many ways, right? We also see that the platforms, in many ways, unless by design they've been purposely intended not to do so, there's a loss of authorship, there's a loss of provenance. And I think that someone like Ted Nelson, who pioneered a data structure that would be a form of two-way internet data structure, this has been kind of argued for Jaron Lanier in his book, Who Owns the Future? And I think that it's interesting to kind of reflect how platforms could be in the use of data structures that do not erase provenance, that we can actually go forward and back and understand, the provenance of content. So in a way, subverting the notion of perhaps the notion of fake news that has become so popular as well. Other ideas like the Creative Commons license, and in particular, the particular attribution of share alike, seems to be very important for me in the sense of the opportunity of remixing, right? Remixing is not something that we can do legally in many ways due to copyright. So understanding that content could be remixed and socially reorganized, I consider a kind of a central feature for platform content and platform design. And again, the notion of cooperativism, so platforms that are owned by those who participate in them, right? The idea that that Trevor Schultz has put forward, that platform cooperativism, as opposed to be, the Uber model where you have a centralized company owning no taxis, right? And the gig worker actually taking part of this platform. What would it be to kind of consider forms of platforms in which the worker owns the platform, right? And I think that those are kind of incredibly interesting examples to consider what does it mean to consider platform design. So we have challenges, certainly, and we have certain responses at the moment of designing platforms, right? In architecture, I would argue we don't have fundamentally a platform, a robust platform to the exchange of ideas or the exchange of content. Maybe the closest thing we have in terms of 3D models, would be things like 3D Warehouse, or we seem to gravitate to the sharing and propagation of visual content through things like Instagram. And initiatives like the WikiHow or the Open Building Institute, which are open source frameworks for architecture, rely on things like GitHub or other kind of platforms that are perhaps not necessarily centrally connected to the notion of architecture. I certainly see video games in that extent as a medium that is very well equipped to carry this potential challenge, or kind of at least propose opportunities. Games like The Sims have incredible tools for the production of content that is authored by users, and there's a kind of a very vibrant community surrounding the production of architecture, even though it's certainly away from the kind of architecture we consider at least meaningful within an academic circle. I started doing video game research in 2013 in the Bartlett, and some of my work with the students back then still remains important for me in the sense of how do we use video game technology to really open the kind of form of computation to a public. So that work led me to design my own video game, my first kind of proof of concept of how we could start engaging a public through a video game. And that is the video game Blockhood, which was published in 2016 as a kind of an early access format and then released finally in 2017. So I want to share with you this video where I explain the project a little bit. So Blockhood, it's a city building simulator in the tradition of games like SimCity, but it really starts from an ecological model. It reflects that SimCity has an economic model behind, and in many ways, Blockhood puts the ecological at the foreground. What this means is that you don't have to pay for building anything. You just need to kind of, basically the main mechanic of the game has to do with maintaining the ecological dependencies between the things you create. So it's about upkeep, it's about maintaining whatever you create as a beating heart, as opposed to managing, the funds for achieving a particular configuration, right? The main model that the game offers is that every unit in the game has a series of inputs and outputs, right? There's something that is being produced and something that is being consumed. And the analogy here is something like a tree that would actually use water, but perhaps produce fresh air and oxygen, right? But like that, you could actually start thinking of any entity in the city, and we kind of discretize blocks or the city into blocks, a catalog of over 196 blocks, if I remember correctly, where each one of those would be using a resource and producing another one. What this led is that the player kind of starts slowly creating their own problems in a way. And whatever you create has dependencies, and you have to kind of complete those dependencies. And this kind of very quickly reveals the web of interdependencies that exist. One of the key features of blockhood was not to allow any kind of externality, in the sense that the management of waste, the management of food production, everything was internalized to this block. So we wanted to bring a certain kind of explicit narrative here, an ecological narrative, where you cannot really get rid of your waste by kind of sending it somewhere else or paying for it, but rather what would it be to consider a city that has to conceive of its own food production, of its own energy production within the confines of this kind of small parcel of land, right? So obviously blockhood is a diagram, and it's an educational one at that. It doesn't try to invoke the production of a real building, but it certainly tries to reflect upon the interdependencies of systems. As you can see here, the game was exploring different mediums. This is a VR version of the game. And it also has a narrative version, which initially was conceived as something a bit more playful, but it eventually became quite important for me, and it led me to produce the next video game, Combinatorics. So the game really started from a very simple prototype, initially called Block, a game produced by Satoru Sugihara, Sergio Irigoyen, and myself for the Smart Geometry conference. It really evolved to become a simulator not only of urban environments, but also natural ones. There's no distinction in blockhood between nature tiles or artificial tiles. So you might as well create a forest where you're creating the affordances for natural wildlife, or a city where you're creating affordances for humans. There's no distinction in the simulation between those different forms of agency. The model behind the game, as I explained, there's kind of an interdependence of resources, and that allows you to really model what would be, for instance, an industrial food production system where certain entities would have maybe more yields, or there would be dependencies to pesticides or so on, or an organic food production system that, again, yields might be different, quality of food might be different, different forms of outlets for the selling and buying of the food might happen. But in a way, it's up to the player to realize that these patterns exist, and within the game, those will have their own consequences. The computation uses strongly kind of a form of cellular automata, where units are using adjacencies as form of synergies, and they really start kind of, and as I mentioned before, a kind of a dependency of resources, right? At any given time, player is presented with a multiplicity of layers of data to consider a building block through its structure, through its decay data that determines how a block would eventually break or collapse if it's not sustained, production and access, which are some of the key features of the game. So I really want to emphasize that the game wasn't meant to make players win or find an optimal pattern, but rather kind of explore the possibility space of architecture within the engine, where patterns, as I understand them or has been reflecting upon, it's not a better solution, but rather an efficient solution to a particular context. So the patterns are not, there's no one solution to the game. There's a series of possible patterns that are kind of meaningful for players. And those are celebrated as diverse and not really a kind of as a central. There's no kind of one criteria that would lead to believe that there's one better pattern than another one. So it really tries to argue for an open-ended design system, right? Where the production can lead to radically different solutions or organizations in this case. In the flip side of each organization, there's the model of decay. Each tile, as I mentioned, has this decay state. So the player is constantly gravitating to think, how do I maintain this system in balance? Otherwise, I'm kind of flirting with the possibility of this dystopian future where the whole building is destroyed, right? So, and the exploration of VR technologies, I've been asked a lot about this, what is the impact of new technologies like VR and augmented reality in many cases. And for me, I think that we're still grappling with real-time computation, which is fundamentally kind of a symbiosis between human beings as designers that are coupled with algorithmic systems. And I think that that for me still remains as kind of a central focus of attention. And things like VR, for me, there's certainly a kind of very interesting, like, or fancy displays for the content. They're more immersive. They have certain, you know, you can reflect upon the content in a different way. And I think that the VR version of Blockhood is certainly the best way of playing it. But it does not change that the foundations of a real-time system, one in which the algorithm is kind of creating a feedback loop with the player, that's something that I feel like it's certainly worth continuing research on, because there's kind of a lot of nuances in that process. Games, in a way, are a medium that I kind of really admire in the way they kind of embed the tutorial, the learning process. They really, it's a form of software that really takes you from not knowing anything to really becoming an expert through the way the pacing of the content is produced, right? And in many ways, I never thought that my work on computation would touch on the narrative. And with Blockhood, there was an attempt to do a small story. There was some personal interest that I wanted to touch upon, and those were kind of portrayed through a story. And I realized that the affordances of certain narratives really kind of created a different connection with an audience, and that really became a central point of departure for Commonhood, the next game that I'll show in a minute. The game really allowed me to open up a communication or a kind of conversation with a much more global audience. And I can show you some images of some workshops that we've done in Spain or in Los Angeles, but that's nothing compared to the kind of thousands of players that, you know, engaged with the game globally through the internet, obviously. So I'm always kind of interested of how does a medium, when produced to be able to reach such an audience, is able to establish a dialogue, and how can it really start opening protocols for its own redesign, perhaps through suggestions, or perhaps through modding, which is a very strong culture within gaming, to change its own protocols for further production, right? So that led me to Commonhood. In many ways, some of the shortcomings of Blockhood in terms of, for me, were to really think of the city as a diagram and not really allow for an engine to be much closer, a much closer depiction of reality, or kind of being able to, you know, engage more closely with the ideas of realism that I mentioned at the beginning. So Commonhood really starts from the narrative. So I'm gonna play this video, which is our latest trailer. It's something that we just finished maybe a few weeks ago, and it really gives you a sense of what we're trying to do with the game. So Commonhood embarks into a social narrative, one in which the main player, the main character, Nikki, has been lost her home through an eviction process, and it's in the position or forced to kind of occupy this abandoned factory, where she becomes a squatter, right? So you are kind of building a squatter community. So really from a form of precarity, starting to kind of construct what is the kind of resources that you can gather in terms of literally, you know, material resources, but also sweat equity in forms of labor, or access to knowledge, and how gradually you can actually start constructing a form of self-sustained community from within this context, right? The game really has a progression that has to do with technology itself, and that is put in contrast to the failed dreams of the abandoned factory that, in a way, you are inhabiting. Obviously, it's certainly influenced by cities like Detroit, where urban decay has become quite prominent. So what does it mean for a new generation to really inhabit some of this ideological heritage, in a way, and what are the kind of forms of organizations and social organizations that can lead to a new form of architecture. So it's a very open-ended game. It's a sandbox kind of game where you're constructing the means of production, and you are kind of managing not just yourself as a user, but also a series of other characters. There's a lot of work that has to do with the artificial intelligence behind the characters and what is the portrayal of a character or an NPC within the game. So I'll explain that a little bit more right now. So for me, the question behind commonhood is, where is architecture conceived? I think that we traditionally think of architecture from a blank piece of paper or from an empty three-dimensional environment like Rhino or Maya. And those environments are explicitly empty. They're like very separated from some of the social conditions or some of the realities that we see in the world. So I started thinking, what would be a form of computation that is deeply entangled with some form of social narrative, right? And would that make a difference? Would that make the difference in what we create? So the setting, we spend maybe, I don't know, I would say 70% of the work of commonhood has to do with the development of the world and the setting, more than the geometry tools, right? Like more than the how much flexibility do we give the player in terms of form production. As I mentioned, the workers or the participants of this community are not just entities, abstract entities of labor. There's not a form of human resource, but rather they are kind of human beings portrayed digitally with narratives and with stories. So that kind of, there's friction in every request or any interest of producing something, right? There's always kind of a feedback loop between the player and the intention of architecture that is kind of entangled by the simulation, right? More technically, the game really gives you a large range of craftable items that are mediated by access to manufacturing tools, like in the form of machines. And again, that leads to a series of craftable objects. And it invites the player to take different routes. What are the different kind of settings in which you might want to work to produce different kind of outputs, right? So any model of architecture is really thought through scarcity. It's mediated by scarcity. Scarcity of materials and capital, access to tools and infrastructure, access to knowledge, right? Organizational recipes and forms of informational models of knowledge, and access to labor and human resource, right? I really want to believe that the work produced within this game or attempts to really entangle the player with the social narratives of the game. So the game really reflects upon this kind of human-computer interaction. What is the symbiosis between the player and the digital system, right? And I think that in the tradition of video games, there's been a multiple models to take or overcome in many ways, right? There is the model of the God game, where the player takes full agency over and has full power over the world. And we're certainly kind of developing a critique to that model, where the player is more entangled in the system that rather than kind of an above figure that it has all powerful. Or in the idea of the worker's abstraction, which is a tradition of worker placement games, like things like Agricola board games, but also digital tycoon games. There's again a critique to the worker as a simulated entity that it's again an abstraction of labor, and rather how do we kind of reconnect some of the social narratives to these kind of simulations, right? So I think that there's been interesting examples in the video game world that has started to show the opportunities of complexity to permeate, in the sense of like how different overlapping systems can actually lead to a different kind of design. I think RimWorld, Prison Architect, and Dwarf Fortress are games that come to mind as certainly kind of starting to embrace these forms of complexity in interactive media. And certainly I hope that commonhood could follow that tradition. The narrative of commonhood really tries to present a place where architecture happens through the development of trust, through the development of a collective and a form of wealth production that is shared and kind of common among those inhabiting this place. So these are some images and screenshots of the game. The model of the game also kind of reflects and rejects some of the foundations of games like Sims, which have been built upon the Maslow's hierarchy of needs. When you think of a worker, what is the self-actualization of a simulated entity. These different kind of hierarchies is something that we're trying to kind of put collectivity and forms of collective organization higher perhaps than the ones of self-actualization. So as you can see, some of the work that we are doing with our kind of simulated entities, these are our current behavioral trees, and we spend a lot of time kind of tinkering with this and understanding what is the feedback loop between the player and these kind of simulated entities has to do with really telling a human story and understanding that there's not just an exploitation, a form of exploitation of a simulated entity. And a lot of these reflections really have been kind of interestingly brought up by Jenny Odell's work on How to Do Nothing, and her beautiful book that really reflects upon what does it mean to be productive or perhaps even unproductive, right? So we're a model where work is not everything, right? Where work is not just consider a human resource, but rather what is the kind of life outside work, and can simulated entities also consider that? And again, the player is invited to kind of take different paths in the process of engaging with such a simulation. Finally, the game has been thought to be an architectural platform, one in which the sharing of recipes or architectural designs would happen in different forms, most explicitly through our system of blueprints, in which players can actually share not a 3D file of a creation, but rather a series of sequences over time. Where what are the mechanisms, and I think this is where we are right now on design, what are the mechanisms for different players online to determine what is meaningful and valuable for the network? And you have things like the like button or the Reddit upvoting systems or forms of rewards. And I think that really kind of designing or working with some of these design principles can really lead for the production of many different protocols for what is produced, but also how interesting content is actually curated within the network. So these are some of the small examples of different blueprints that we can create, and we have this kind of blueprint viewer that allows us to kind of, prior to like an online sharing form, just really revise what you're doing. And finally, I think that the game wants to reflect on what does it mean to kind of consider the ecology of labor, right? What does it mean to kind of embed our own architectural intentions within a simulated environment that is not just doing what we want, an environment that is not based on the ideas of abundance, like any 3D package, where it's imagine a Rhino where you can run out of lines, or you can run out of primitives, right? And you might have to find a way of finding more of those. What is a kind of architecture mediated by such a scarcity? And how do we refocus our kind of design work through the engagement of such a platform? When we think of things of automation, they're not just thought as an opportunity, but rather as a kind of an impact and a social impact in the displacement of workers and the kind of the value of who has access to this form of infrastructure. So this is a short video showing our current state. It demonstrates many multiple like digital entities kind of engaging with the form of fabrication. That takes time. There's no real copy pasting within the game. Everything has to kind of be produced with available resources. And potentially once you have a design in place, you can actually share it with your community through our online platform, which is something that we have been prototyping and working on, as you can see here. So the game hasn't been released yet. We're intending for release at the end of this year, but we're actively testing to see how can we really engage an audience that is capable to producing content and maintaining kind of a community where architectural ideas could be shared and proliferated. So looking ahead, some of what continues to drive the work has to do with a design mediated by scarcity that's central to the game and to my own research, how do we simulate labor considering the productive and the unproductive, as I mentioned? How do we incentivize the production of online commons? And I think that that is something that is very much in my interest of how these digital platforms allow users to produce content that is meaningful for them. And how do we make architectural knowledge accessible and shareable through online platforms such as video games? At the same time, at the level of data structures, we're thinking of tracking provenance, ecological dependencies of materials and so on. And also, how do we kind of give a fair recognition and remuneration for content creation in the case of players? Just to finish, I like finishing with this quote from Donna Haraway, discussing the idea of sympoiesis. And for me, sympoiesis in many ways replaces kind of the notion of autopoiesis that has been quite prominently featured in some recent architectural theory. So the idea of sympoiesis is a simple word. It means making with. Nothing makes itself. Nothing is really autopoietic or self-organizing. And I hope that my work reflects upon that in the future as well. With that, I want to close it. Thank you.